They always say, don't judge a book by its cover. But in neighborhoods like Richmond Heights, people don't judge books. They judge hoodies. And on one quiet evening, a man named Darius Knox became the story everyone thought they understood until they didn't. He wasn't famous, wasn't flashy, didn't drive a fancy car, just a black man in a hoodie, minding his business, driving home from work, but to the wrong officer, on the wrong street, in the wrong skin. That was all it took. This is not just a story about a traffic stop. This is a story about assumption, about how power moves when it's unchecked, about the silent wars people fight just to be left alone. But most of all, this is a story about what happens when the person you try to humiliate turns out to be your final exam. You won't hear yelling in this story. You won't see fists flying or cars crashing. What you'll see is poise, a man who never raised his voice, but made an entire department fall silent. Because this isn't just about injustice. This is about presence, about knowing exactly who you are, even when they don't want to see it. And if you're thinking, well, it's just a misunderstanding, these things happen. Ask yourself this: would it have happened if he were wearing a suit instead of a hoodie? Would it have happened if he didn't look like someone they were told to fear? Would it have happened to someone who didn't look like us? This is not fiction. This is inspired by truth, a truth that walks through American streets every day, quietly, patiently, until one day it stops walking and starts watching back. This is the story of a man in a hoodie, a black story they tried to silence, but not today. The streets of Richmond Heights were quiet in that time of evening, when the world starts to dim but hasn't quite given up on the day. The streetlights hadn't flickered on yet, but the sun had already slipped low enough that shadows stretched long and lazy across trimmed hedges and imported SUVs. It was the kind of neighborhood where silence wasn't peace, it was policy. Everything about it was curated: the grass, the fences, the smiles. Even the quiet had been designed, bought, and insured. And through that silence rolled a black 2011 Toyota Camry, the kind of car nobody looked at twice. Behind the wheel sat Darius Knox, alone, 40, give or take a year, tall, fit, calm in a way that made people either curious or uncomfortable, depending on how much power they thought they had. He wasn't smiling. He didn't frown either. His face was neutral, practiced, like someone who had lived long enough to know that expression itself could be dangerous, especially when paired with black skin and a hoodie. Because Darius was wearing one. Not because he was trying to be anyone. Not because he wanted to make a statement. It was just cold. The HVAC in the Camry had been unreliable for years, and frankly, it was just a habit now. Pull the hood up, get through the day. But in neighborhoods like Richmond Heights, hoodies didn't mean comfort. They meant alert status yellow. He knew that, and he wore it anyway. Darius lived 15 minutes away, technically in the same county but a world apart. His house wasn't big, but it was clean, paid off, decorated not for aesthetics, but for comfort. He had a dog named Moses, a back porch with two lawn chairs, one always left empty for his brother, gone 6 years now. He didn't have a wife, didn't date much anymore. He kept to himself, worked hard, and once a week he took long drives just to clear his head. This was one of those drives. He'd finished up a long day of interviews, internal investigations into misconduct within local police departments. Most days, his job felt like scrubbing blood out of white carpets with a toothbrush. Endless, quiet, necessary. Darius was a federal agent, but not the kind people saw in movies. No gun drawn, no chases. He worked in internal oversight and professional standards, part of the Department of Justice. He was the guy who got called when officers crossed the line, the guy who reviewed the footage, pulled the phone records, took the testimony, the guy who got resented in every department he entered. He didn't mind. As he passed the edge of Richmond Heights, a place he'd driven through many times before, he noticed a set of flashing red and blue lights flicker on in his rearview mirror. At first he figured the cruiser would pass. Maybe there was an emergency. But as the light stayed steady behind him, Darius signaled, slowed, and pulled over to the side of the empty street. He put the car in park, both hands on the wheel. The radio hummed low from the dash, Luther Vandross singing about never too much. The irony wasn't lost on him. His breathing slowed, not because he was scared, just measured. He'd trained men on how to behave during a stop like this, and he'd been stopped before, more times than made sense, less than many of his friends. He didn't resent it. He didn't accept it either. It just was. You learn to survive first, fight later. The cruiser door opened behind him. Boots crunched on gravel. Officer Jordan Price, early 30s, walked up with the confidence of someone who believed in the weight of his badge more than the purpose behind it. Sharp haircut, straight posture, sunglasses on, even in the shade. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked, voice flat but edged. "No, sir," Darius replied, calm, clipped, controlled. "You were driving slowly, real slowly. Looked like you were casing the neighborhood." Darius didn't answer immediately, not because he was stunned, but because he wasn't surprised. The excuse was always creative. "My speed was under the posted limit," he said evenly. "Wasn't aware that was a concern." "You live around here?" Darius considered lying. It would be easier, but lies always come with interest. "Number. But I work in the area." "What kind of work?" "Federal oversight." Price raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "Internal affairs." That didn't seem to clarify things for Price. It just seemed to annoy him. "License and registration." Darius handed them over. Slowly, deliberately. No sudden moves. No muttered phrases. Just obedience born not of respect, but of strategy. Price took the documents, stepped back toward his cruiser. Darius could hear the faint buzz of the radio. He waited. Then the footsteps came back. Slower this time. He knew the routine. Stare at the ID too long. Try to figure out why something doesn't add up. "You said internal affairs?" Price asked again, but this time with a smirk. "Yes. Got any proof of that?" Darius sighed internally. He'd done this dance before. He reached over to the passenger seat, pulled out a slim, leather badge holder, and opened it gently, holding it up. "Federal DOJ, Internal Oversight Division." Price stared for a moment too long. Then he looked back at Darius. "You don't really look like a Fed." There it was, not even subtle, not even coded, just thrown out there like it was casual banter. Darius didn't respond. Sometimes silence was sharper than a comeback. Price looked away first. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" the officer said next. Darius tilted his head slightly. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" "Just routine." Darius considered that for a beat. Then slowly he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. The air was cooler now, crisp. He stood tall, shoulders back, eyes forward. No aggression, no submission. Just a man, in a hoodie, being watched. Across the street, a woman walking a labradoodle paused. From a window above, a man in a sleeveless undershirt moved the curtain slightly. Darius could feel the heat, not of the sun, but of judgment, assumption, and quiet resentment. Price circled the car, eyes scanning. He glanced at the trunk, the plates, the shoes on Darius's feet, looking for something, anything. You got any weapons on you? No. You mind if I pat you down? I do mind, and unless you have probable cause, I'd prefer we not go down that road. Price froze. The tension in the air thickened. Then he smirked again. You think you know everything, huh? No, Darius replied. Just enough. That was the moment Darius knew. This wasn't about the hoodie, or the car, or the neighborhood. This was about power, and Price had just realized he didn't have as much of it as he thought. Darius didn't smile. He didn't threaten. He didn't name drop. He just stood there, tall, quiet, present, like a ghost that refused to disappear. And somewhere inside that silence, Price finally heard it, the beginning of the end. Mind telling me again where you work? Price asked, still circling the Camry like a wolf trying to justify a pounce. Darius didn't flinch. Department of Justice, Internal Oversight. Price let out a short breath through his nose. Not a laugh. More like a leak in confidence. He stood still for a second, arms crossed. So what? You spy on cops or something? I investigate misconduct, Darius replied calmly, but only when it's warranted. The way he said it, firm without arrogance, was like handing someone a loaded gun and trusting them not to shoot. Price didn't like that. Not the words, not the tone, not the fact that Darius hadn't so much as raised his voice since the stop began. Control was a threat when it came from the wrong kind of man in a hoodie, and Price had never liked being questioned. Not in high school, not in the academy, not on the job. He was used to people answering, not asking, so he tried to tip the scale. I've had a long day, he said, voice low. Just looking out for the neighborhood. You seem unusually composed for someone being questioned. Darius tilted his head slightly. Would you prefer panic? That was it. The first strike. Small, petty, instinctive. I'll be running your plates again, Price muttered, already walking back to the cruiser. You can never be too careful these days. He disappeared inside the patrol car, door slamming shut. Darius stood by the hood of his car, hands resting at his sides. The street was quiet again, but not empty. A boy on a skateboard drifted past, slowed, watched, kept going. 3 houses down, an older white man stepped onto his porch with a coffee mug and a gaze like a rifle. Even now, Darius could feel the question floating in the air. What did he do? It never started with a charge. It started with a look, then a whisper, then a guess, then a headline. The hoodie made it easier to skip straight to the assumption. Inside the cruiser, Price was stewing. He tapped a pen against his notepad, scrolling through Darius's license info again, like he was hoping to find a typo he'd missed. But everything came back clean. He wasn't angry that Darius had credentials. He was angry that credentials hadn't been his first guess. Price wasn't a bad cop, at least not in the way they wrote about in lawsuits. But he was entitled, and that kind of man doesn't handle being wrong very well. He stared at Darius through the windshield. The man was still standing calmly, hands visible, posture perfect, like he knew what page of the handbook this all lived on. Price hated that, so he came back out. Slower this time, one hand resting on his belt, not threatening, just reminding. Got a lot of answers for someone who doesn't live here, he said, voice dry. I've been answering your questions respectfully, Darius replied. That's one way to look at it. I wasn't aware there was another. The tension wasn't just between them now. It had bled into the air itself. This wasn't about neighborhood safety anymore. This was ego, power, control, and Darius was failing to submit. Price stepped closer. Too close. Darius didn't move. You know, Price said, lowering his voice, people like you usually get a warning. If they're polite, Darius raised an eyebrow. People like me. You think you're clever, Price snapped suddenly, eyes narrowing. But you're just another guy in a hoodie thinking a badge makes him special. That was it. The real first strike. Not physical, not legal, but personal. And Darius felt it. He didn't respond, not with words. Instead, he slowly reached into his wallet again, pulled out the same badge case, and held it up. Not toward Price, but toward his own chest. You see this? He said quietly. This doesn't make me special. It makes me responsible. Price snorted. For what? Telling us how to do our jobs? For noticing when you forget how to. There was no malice in Darius's tone, just truth, dressed in quiet authority, and that scared Price more than shouting ever could. From the side of the street, someone snapped a photo. Neither man noticed, but the image, a black man in a hoodie holding up a badge to a white cop who looked like he'd just been outmaneuvered, would soon find its way online, and it would speak louder than either of them had that day. I'll let you off with a warning, Price muttered finally, folding Darius's documents and holding them out like they were contaminated. Darius took them without a word, but he didn't move. He didn't rush to his car, didn't drive off like a man who just avoided a ticket. He stood still for just a second longer and looked Price in the eye. The kind of look that says, I know what you did. I know why you did it, and I'm still standing. As Darius climbed into his Camry, a soft thunk echoed from the door. The engine turned over, but before he pulled away, he lowered his window. Officer Price, he said calmly. Price turned, surprised to hear his voice again. I'll be filing a formal notice of contact with your department. As a courtesy. Price blinked. A courtesy? Darius nodded. Yes, so you're aware. Not everyone gives second chances. Then he drove off, slow and steady, the same way he'd come in. Back in the cruiser, Price stood frozen, and something crawled over him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. The man in the hoodie wasn't supposed to have that much control, that much clarity, but Darius hadn't threatened him, hadn't shouted, hadn't filmed him. He'd just been better, better trained, better tempered, better. Price climbed back into the squad car, slammed the door harder than he needed to, and sat in silence. No citation, no arrest, no ego left intact. Just the uncomfortable realization that the uniform alone didn't make him right, and that maybe for the first time, he'd picked the wrong man to push. Down the street, a mailbox flag waved in the breeze. The sun dipped a little lower, and a teenager on a skateboard pulled out his phone to watch the photo he'd just uploaded. No caption, just the image. A hoodie, a stare, a badge, and a story that was only just beginning. 3 days had passed. No charges filed, no formal complaint yet. But the story, it had legs, and it was sprinting. The photo, taken by a 17-year-old high school senior named Eli Morales, had made its rounds. First on a small Reddit thread about neighborhood profiling, then Twitter, Then Facebook groups with names like Justice Watch and Check Your Bias. The photo, a black man in a hoodie holding a federal badge. A white officer, lips curled halfway between confusion and contempt. And a street so quiet you could hear the tension through the pixels. No context, no caption, just impact. It didn't take long before someone recognized the face in the hoodie. Someone always does. That's Agent Knox. Someone had commented under the post. He came to our department last year after that use of force incident. Real quiet, real smart. Took 3 guys off duty with 1 report. And just like that, the mystery was gone, replaced by something far more powerful: recognition. The man in the hoodie had a name and a reputation. By the 4th day, Darius's inbox was full. Messages from coworkers, from ex-colleagues, from 2 journalists. One was polite, the other less so. They both wanted the story. He gave them nothing. Because for Darius, this wasn't new. It wasn't shocking. It wasn't even personal. It was Tuesday. But what made it different this time was the echo, the ripple. People weren't just watching, they were talking. And not all of them were kind. At a nearby precinct, the whispers started. Did you see the video? Why didn't Price recognize him? Why was Knox even in that neighborhood? He's not even from here, man. What's he doing profiling us? Yes, profiling us. That's how fast the narrative turned. Now Darius was the invader, the disruptor, the threat in reverse. Officer Price, he didn't say much, out loud. But in private, he was spinning, claiming he'd been set up, that he'd followed protocol, that Knox had an attitude. And in cop culture, an attitude is just another word for noncompliance with your own inferiority. The real storm came the next afternoon. Darius had been called into a precinct across the county line for a standard review meeting. Nothing unusual, except when he walked through the glass doors of the lobby, every head turned. Not in greeting, in analysis, in accusation. The receptionist, a woman he'd spoken to 3 times before, froze mid-sentence as he approached the sign-in sheet. He nodded. She did not nod back. The waiting area, once neutral, was now loaded. 2 officers at the water cooler stopped mid-sip. A civilian in a gray hoodie did a double-take, then looked away, as if to avoid guilt by association. And behind the reception desk, someone clicked a mouse rapidly, maybe pulling up his profile, maybe sending a message. He didn't know. He didn't care. But he felt it. He felt all of it. The thing people like him were taught to ignore in order to survive. The eyes, the tension, the unnamed accusations with no evidence, but all the volume of truth. As he sat in the meeting room, waiting for the captain, the door opened. And in walked Lieutenant Brandon Hale, tall, built like a retired linebacker, always carried himself like the room owed him quiet. Hale had never liked Darius, didn't trust federal oversight, didn't trust anyone who didn't wear a local patch. You made quite the splash this week, Hale said, sitting across from him without invitation. I didn't make anything, Darius replied. I pulled over. I was let go. End of interaction. Hale scoffed. That's not how it's being received. I can't control perception. Can't or won't? Darius folded his hands. Calm, steady. I didn't make the photo viral. I didn't post it. I didn't comment. But you didn't deny it either, Hale pressed. I didn't need to. The picture speaks for itself. Silence stretched like wire between them. Tight, thin, dangerous. Then Hale leaned in. You might think you're helping things, Knox, but what you're doing, coming into neighborhoods flashing badges, It's making good cops nervous. Darius didn't answer right away. Because this was humiliation. Not loud, not messy, but slow, professional, dressed in concern. The kind that made you the problem for surviving the problem. He met Hale's eyes. I didn't flash my badge until after I was pulled from my vehicle and questioned without cause. Hale sat back. That's not what I heard. You heard what made you comfortable. More silence. Then, you should know Officer Price has received support from the department. Internal affairs may not find cause. Darius nodded once. Understood. He rose. I'll submit my notes and transcript of the stop by end of week. Where will you be until then? Doing my job. He didn't wait to be dismissed. He walked out, still wearing the hoodie, still unbothered by permission. But that's when it hit him. As he stepped into the hallway, passing 3 young officers, one of them, a woman barely out of training, whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "There he is, the guy who thinks the hoodie makes him a hero." She laughed. The others followed. And that was the real public humiliation. Not the stop, not the photo, not even the meeting, but the way truth was mocked when it came from the wrong mouth, in the wrong skin, wearing the wrong fabric. That night, Darius went home, took Moses for a walk, and didn't say a word to anyone. The street was dark, no cameras, no voices, just the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The wind brushed his hoodie, and for the first time in a long time, he felt tired. Not physically, but tired of being polite about injustice, tired of being patient while others caught up, tired of being expected to behave better than the people failing him. He sat on the porch after the walk, hoodie still on, sipping lukewarm tea from an old ceramic mug. He watched a moth throw itself at the porch light over and over again. Software, desperate, repeating, like a warning, like a story, like a system. And then he did something he rarely did. He took out his phone, opened the camera, looked directly into the lens, and snapped a photo. No caption, no badge, just the hoodie, and the eyes of a man who'd had enough of being quiet about what he saw. It started with a flyer, taped to the bulletin board in the staff hallway of the precinct. No one claimed to put it there. No one saw who did. But there it was, a simple black and white printout, the kind you'd expect for a missing pet or a charity car wash. Except it wasn't a dog, and it wasn't a fundraiser. It was Darius Knox's face. Screenshot from the viral photo, cropped tight, no context. Above it, bold red letters. Watch out for this guy, DOJ rat in our backyard. Below it, smile for the feds, you're being watched. Someone had added a crude drawing of a hoodie with devil horns. Someone had also scrawled, in Sharpie, snitch in a sweater. When Darius walked past it, he didn't stop, didn't take it down, didn't flinch, but he felt it. A burn at the base of his neck. The same kind of burn you get when you know someone's behind you, with a knife they won't use yet, but might. He made it 6 steps before someone pulled it down behind him. But it was too late. The image was already in a dozen group chats, already captioned, twisted, shared. It wasn't just a reaction anymore. It was a campaign. That night, his email inbox lit up, not with spam, not with business, with warnings. Just thought you should know, your file got leaked. Someone passed your photo to a Facebook group full of off-duty cops. Check Twitter. Search your name with hashtag HoodieRat. He didn't. He didn't need to. The damage wasn't in the comments. It was in the intent. They weren't whispering anymore. They were organizing. At 9:46 p.m., his doorbell rang. 3 short buzzes. Darius opened the door, hand on the deadbolt, cautious but not yet alarmed. Standing there was Kendra Baines, a fellow federal investigator he'd worked with twice before. Sharp, fair, no time for drama. She held her phone out toward him. "You need to see this," she said, voice low. He took the phone. On it, a group chat thread, name blurred, but the content clear. Photos of him, screenshots of the badge, jokes. "Next time I see him, I'm bringing my own body cam. Bet he cries if you yell boo loud enough. Wonder how long he'd last if he wasn't hiding behind that DOJ badge." Then this one. "He's not a cop, he's a target." Darius handed the phone back. Kendra didn't ask if he was okay. She knew better. She just said, "You need to move carefully. They've crossed the line." But crossing the line wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that no one above them did anything. No email from the regional commander. No apology from the department spokesperson. No call from Officer Price. Just silence, official silence, which in these situations is always complicity wearing a tie. The next morning, Darius walked into a building and found a parking ticket on his Camry windshield. He hadn't parked illegally. His permit was in clear view. The time on the ticket, 6:12 a.m. The earliest citation he'd ever received in 6 years at that office. Coincidence? Maybe. But when he walked into the lobby and past the security desk, the officer on duty, one he used to joke with about basketball, didn't nod, didn't look up, just stared at his screen, as if Darius was no longer real. That was the turning point. Not the flyer, not the group chats, not the meme going around Instagram showing Darius next to a hooded cobra labeled, "Venom comes in quiet packages." It was the shift, the collective decision to treat him like an outsider. Even in rooms he used to belong to, even among people who knew better. Because when one person stands up in a hoodie, it's easy to laugh. When that person turns out to have more power than expected, it becomes easier to pretend they don't exist. He tried to focus, tried to do his job, but everything was slower now. Emails delayed, requests lost. Doors that used to open with a badge now needed authorization. And in the lunchroom, people left when he entered, or worse, stayed and spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "Guess you can't trust the quiet ones anymore." He probably has a wire on him right now. The jokes weren't clever, but they were coordinated. And then the leak happened. An unredacted case file, one of Darius's own reports, emailed anonymously to a blog that specialized in exposing federal overreach. It wasn't dramatic, just bureaucratic, technical, but it had his signature, and someone had doctored the document with a fake timestamp, making it seem like he'd reviewed and closed a case before all witness statements had been collected. A subtle falsification, but enough to start a fire. Within hours, the story hit 2 local outlets. Federal oversight agent accused of premature case closure. Hoodie cop under scrutiny for DOJ misconduct. DOJ called for an internal audit. Darius was placed on administrative hold, not for punishment, but for optics. They called it a formality. He called it exactly what they wanted. For the first time in years, he sat at home during the weekday. No badge, no laptop, just silence. But not the good kind, not the porch and coffee kind. The unnatural silence of a man being erased. He spent the first 2 days reorganizing his home office. The third, he walked Moses for nearly 2 hours. The dog was thrilled. But on the fourth day, something inside him snapped. Not in anger, in clarity. They thought they could ruin him with whispers, flyers, edits. But what they didn't understand? Darius Knox had never relied on noise to prove his worth. He didn't come from volume. He came from structure, from facts, from undeniable records. And if they wanted to wage war in the shadows, he'd bring them into the light. That evening, he sat down at his desk and began compiling emails, logs, photos, timestamps, not just from his recent work, but from the past 2 years. Patterns of internal retaliation, chain of command negligence, selective disciplinary actions. By midnight, he had a folder. By morning, he had a case, not for himself, but for every quiet agent who had been punished for telling the truth. They thought they were silencing a man in a hoodie, but what they were really doing was giving him a reason to speak, and Darius Knox was very, very good at making people listen. The day he walked back into the office, no one said a word. Not a hello, not a nod. Just a hallway of closed lips and open eyes, pretending not to look while watching everything. Darius Knox didn't mind. He didn't need a welcome. He had come back with work. And when a man like Darius comes back with work, it's not just a file, it's a reckoning. He stepped into the glass-walled conference room like a shadow returning to its original shape. Laptop in one hand, thin black folder in the other. Still in his hoodie, the same one from the photo. He sat alone at the head of the long table. A dozen seats waited around him like soldiers unsure which side of the war they belonged to. He didn't tap fingers, didn't check his watch. He just waited, because he was no longer requesting the floor. He was the floor. Exactly 5 minutes late, Assistant Director Margaret Liu walked in, flanked by 2 agents from compliance and risk. They didn't smile. He didn't expect them to. She sat across from him. "Mr. Knox, ma'am, you requested an emergency session under Clause 6.2, Internal Protective Review?" "I did." "Proceed." No time wasted. Darius opened the folder and slid it forward. Inside, 27 printed pages, chronological, coded, highlighted. He opened his laptop and spoke. In under 7 minutes, he laid out a pattern. 4 incidents of subtle retaliation post-viral photo, 2 manipulated case files, 8 instances of procedural delay tied to his credentials. A timeline showing Officer Jordan Price's disciplinary record had mysteriously vanished from internal databases the same week Darius was put on hold, and a leaked internal group chat log from a private phone of one of the officers, obtained legally under whistleblower provision. He said all of it calmly, without accusation, without anger, because the truth was strong enough on its own. By the time he was done, no one had touched their water glasses. Lou stared at the screen, then at the papers. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Knox?" "I'm not suggesting," he replied. "I'm reporting." Silence. Then one of the compliance agents spoke. "This is extensive." "It's conservative," Darius answered. "I only brought what I could prove without subpoena." Lou leaned back. "And what is your requested action?" Darius finally looked her in the eye. "I want full review authorization of every case Officer Price has touched in the last 2 years, and every supervisor who signed off on his record purge." Lou didn't flinch, but she didn't speak either, which in bureaucratic terms was already a retreat. "I also want a protective oversight order for all internal agents flagged for disruptive behavior over the last 12 months. The second agent raised an eyebrow. You mean agents who made people uncomfortable? I mean agents who told the truth and were punished for it, Darius said. Your name's going to be attached to this. I know. You'll have enemies. I have them already. You could be blackballed. Darius finally allowed himself the smallest smile. They tried that already. The next 72 hours moved like controlled fire. Emails were sent, meetings called, databases unlocked. The folder Darius had brought became a wildfire inside the DOJ. Agents whispered it had teeth. Supervisors whispered it had names. By the end of the week, 3 officers were placed on leave. One commander resigned quietly. And Officer Jordan Price transferred. No press release, no warning, just gone. Moved to a training facility 3 counties away. The kind of transfer that sounds like opportunity until you realize it's a holding pattern for people the system wants to forget. But Darius didn't celebrate. He didn't post, didn't tweet, didn't give a quote to the paper that called asking for a comment. He wasn't here for applause. He was here for silence with meaning, the kind that comes after the storm. That Friday he went home early. Moses waited at the door with his tail doing its usual dance of joy. Darius reached down, ruffled the dog's ears. I told you, he said softly. We don't bark unless we have to. Moses huffed and nuzzled his knee in agreement. He stepped out onto his porch, hoodie on, mug in hand. And that's when he saw the envelope. No address, no return label, just tucked under the doormat. He opened it slowly. Inside a photo, the one from the original viral image, but this time printed on high-quality photo paper. Someone had written on it in simple black marker, sometimes the shadow is the one doing the watching. No name, no threat, just acknowledgement. The following week, Darius was invited to speak on a panel about internal accountability. He declined. He got asked to do a podcast. He said no. When asked why, he simply replied, I'm not the story, I'm the reminder. But the world had noticed. Young black agents started requesting hoodie exemptions for casual Fridays. A few departments even removed outdated dress code language that subtly banned urban attire. And one officer from an entirely different state sent Darius a message that simply read, I used to be scared of standing alone in my precinct. Not anymore. Thanks to your story. That night, Darius stood in front of his hallway mirror, adjusting the same navy hoodie he'd worn on the day everything started. He looked at his reflection for a long moment, not searching for something, just confirming it, that despite everything they tried to twist, shame, erase, he was still him, unapologetic, unbroken, undeniable. In the end, he didn't raise his voice, didn't break a window, didn't swing a fist. He just opened a folder, pointed to a line, and watched the dominoes fall. Quietly, completely, powerfully. The fall of Officer Jordan Price didn't happen with sirens or scandal. It happened in paperwork, in emails quietly pulled for review, in archived footage replayed on small monitors in gray rooms, where men in suits took notes with faces that didn't blink. It began with patterns. Darius Knox's file, submitted during his protective oversight review, triggered a mandatory audit, one that quickly unearthed more than the brass wanted to believe. Price had a history, not violent, not flashy, just consistent. Stops made on technicalities, warnings issued disproportionately, a tendency to flag certain drivers for looking out of place. In 6 years, he'd only filed one official complaint against a white civilian, but he'd logged 27 against Black and Latino drivers. No disciplinary history, that part was true, but only because someone had been scrubbing his record clean. They found the cleaner, too, a desk sergeant named Ray Tolman, 30 years in, due to retire next spring. Turns out he'd been manually editing internal complaint files, not erasing, but reclassifying. Unfounded, pending clarification, dismissed due to insufficient evidence. All of it done quietly, all of it outside standard protocol. When internal control confronted him, Tolman folded fast. He wasn't built for this kind of heat. "Look," he said, hands shaking over a cold coffee, "we were just protecting the ones who do the job right. Not everything's racism. Sometimes it's just survival." He thought that would make it better. It didn't. Within a week, both Tolman and Price were suspended indefinitely. But that was just the first tremor. Because once you find a rot in one branch, you check the whole tree. A deeper review revealed 4 similar cases where officers had repeated profiling complaints dismissed through Tolman's manual interventions. An internal memo from 2021 encouraging preemptive red flagging of repeat complainants, most of whom were young black men, and most damning, a group chat among mid-level officers mocking oversight policies with one line reading, "Keep your files clean, and you can stop whoever you want." That message was traced back to a deputy shift commander. He resigned before his hearing. The story made the press by accident. A freelance reporter digging into DOJ reform got wind of the shakeup and filed a FOIA request. When the documents dropped, so did the silence. Internal games, how local cops hid their bias behind bureaucracy, the headlines screamed across regional news sites. Then national. Cable news picked it up by Tuesday. By Thursday, Price's name was trending on social media. Again. But this time, he wasn't a confused cop stopped by a Fed. He was the poster boy for system-enabled profiling. He tried to fight it, hired a lawyer, did a soft interview on a sympathetic podcast where he claimed he was a victim of reverse discrimination and that DOJ operatives like Knox were weaponizing their badges to embarrass honest cops. It didn't land. People weren't listening anymore. They were watching the documents, watching the data, watching the truth they couldn't unsee. Meanwhile, Darius said nothing. He didn't appear on TV, didn't retweet the headlines, didn't give interviews even when approached by the Washington Post. He just kept going to work, every day. Hoodie, badge, case files, same man. But now he walked through the halls with a different kind of silence following him. Respectful silence. The kind earned not through fear, but through precision. The kind that said, he didn't win by yelling, he won by being right. Then came the letter from the DOJ, formally recognizing his findings as the basis for a new internal standard, the Knox Protocol, a federal mandate requiring monthly audit flags for local departments with disproportional stop ratios, protection clauses for agents under internal harassment, and a transparency report published quarterly on all complaint reviews. They didn't ask for his permission to name it after him. They just did. He never framed the letter, but he kept it in a drawer, next to a photo of his brother. As for Price, no charges were filed, no perp walk, no court drama, just paperwork, a letter of termination from his department, and a federal disqualification from reapplying to any law enforcement agency that receives DOJ funding. He could still work security, but never again with a badge. The system hadn't destroyed him, but it had closed its door. Quietly, completely. What hurt him more? The silence, no calls from former colleagues, no GoFundMe raised, no department press release defending his character. Even the podcast that interviewed him deleted the episode 2 weeks later. When he tried to sue for wrongful termination, the judge dismissed it within a month. Lack of standing, but really, lack of credibility. Back in Richmond Heights, the neighbors stopped bringing him mail that was misdelivered. One family crossed the street when he walked his dog. A HOA letter arrived politely asking him to remove any signage or lawn decor referencing political controversy. He didn't have any signs, just a mailbox with his name. That was enough. And somewhere across town, Darius Knox sat on his porch one evening, the sky golden soft, Moses at his feet. A young man, maybe early 20s, walked past on the sidewalk, earbuds in, glancing once, then twice. "Hey," the man said, pulling one bud out. "You're that guy, right? From the photo?" Darius didn't smile, but he nodded once. The young man gave a quiet laugh, almost embarrassed. "I got stopped last week. Same block you did." But the cop, he was polite, said, "Good evening, sir." He shrugged. Might not mean much, but just wanted to say thanks. Darius looked at him for a long moment, then replied, "It always means something." Later that night, he received an internal email. A first-year agent from Nevada, young, black, eager. Subject line, advice question mark. The body of the message was short, "How do you keep from getting angry?" Darius didn't respond right away, but when he did, it was just one sentence. You don't keep from getting angry, you keep from getting small. Because price had fallen, but the story, it was still climbing. The headlines faded, like all headlines do. One day it's the top story. The next it's buried beneath newer noise. A scandal, a tweet, a war on the other side of the ocean. But for Darius Knox, that was the goal all along. Not to stay on the screen, but to stay in someone's memory, quietly, permanently. Because real lessons don't need a microphone, they need a witness. 3 weeks after the Knox Protocol went into effect, he was invited to speak at a conference in D.C., a closed-door summit on federal reform and racial equity in law enforcement. He declined. Instead, he sent a one-page statement. No bullet points, no quotes. Just this: "I don't believe in changing systems. I believe in confronting them, one line at a time. Systems don't fear outrage. They fear proof in the hands of someone who won't flinch." The message was read aloud in front of 200 people. The room went silent. Not because it was poetic, but because it was real. Because Darius had become something rare in the world of endless opinion and performative justice. He had become an example, a story they couldn't discredit because he didn't play their game. He didn't shout, he didn't beg, he didn't threaten. He showed up, badge in one hand, facts in the other, in a hoodie they couldn't ignore. But the real lesson? It wasn't in the policy, it wasn't in the paperwork, it was in what he taught the people watching, especially the ones who looked like him. A week later, Darius received a handwritten letter in the mail. Not an email, not a DM, a real letter, folded once, neatly written. It was from a 15-year-old in Ohio. His name was Caleb. "Dear Mr. Knox, I just wanted to say thank you. I used to think being quiet meant you were weak. I didn't think someone who wears a hoodie like me could ever get respect. But then I saw your picture, and then I saw what happened next. You didn't yell, you didn't fight, you just stood there. And the world changed a little. I wear my hoodie different now." Caleb. Darius read it twice, folded it back, slid it into his desk drawer next to the letter from DOJ. One letter changed a system. The other, it changed a kid. And if he had to choose, he'd keep Caleb's. Because the truth is, the people who most needed the lesson were never the ones mocking him. It wasn't the officers who whispered behind doors. It wasn't the ones who shared memes or doctored files. It was the ones watching from the sidelines. The quiet kids. The black interns afraid to speak up. The single mother working the night shift who told her son to tuck his hoodie in at school. The young officers of color who knew what was wrong, but were too scared to say it. To them, Darius had taught something different. That silence wasn't surrender. That wearing a hoodie didn't mean hiding. It could mean honor. It could mean power. It could mean, I've seen what you do to people like me, and I'm still here. One Saturday morning, he was invited to a youth mentoring session in a high school gym. He wasn't planning to go. He hated public speaking. But something about Caleb's letter changed his mind. He showed up late, wore his hoodie, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because it was cold, and because it had become his armor. Inside the gym, a circle of folding chairs had been set up. 20 students, mostly black, mostly quiet. A few looked up as he entered. One whispered, "Yo, that's him." Another nudged their friend. "Hoodie guy, from the story dot." Darius smiled slightly. He sat in the last chair, letting the host continue. But when it was his turn to speak, he didn't stand. He just leaned forward and asked a question. "How many of you have ever been followed in a store?" Every hand went up. "How many of you have been pulled over when you weren't speeding?" Most hands again. "How many of you thought the best way to deal with it was to say nothing?" Silence, no hands, just lowered eyes. That's when Darius spoke. "I'm not here to tell you to be louder," he said. "I'm here to tell you to be clearer, to be sharper, to be undeniable." A kid in the back raised his hand. "What if they don't listen anyway?" Darius nodded. "Sometimes they won't. That's why you build your case. Every day, you show up. You get better. You don't just exist, you document. Like evidence? Exactly like evidence. Even when it doesn't matter? It always matters," Darius said, "because someday someone's going to try to rewrite your story. And when they do, your facts will be the firewall." The room fell quiet, but not the awkward kind, the kind where truth sinks in. After the session, one of the boys came up to him. He couldn't have been more than 13, shy, but curious. He didn't ask for a photo. He just said, "Do you ever get scared?" Darius thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "Sometimes, but not of them." "Then what?" "Of forgetting why I started." That night, Darius wrote one more note. Not to the DOJ, not to the media, but to himself. He folded a piece of paper in half and wrote 3 lines. "The hoodie is not the problem. Their discomfort is not your burden. Be louder in the way only you can." He taped it to the inside of his closet, next to his pressed suits, and above his row of neatly folded hoodies. The lesson in the end wasn't just about justice. It was about memory, about refusing to let someone else narrate your worth, about knowing that even if the world misreads your silence, you know what it means. And maybe, just maybe, you teach someone else to know it too. Because Darius Knox never went viral again, but he didn't need to. The story had already been told. And the lesson was still walking through hallways, still changing policies, still sitting quietly in back rows of rooms where decisions are made, still wearing a hoodie, still black, still proof that you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to mean what you stand for. The air in Richmond Heights was cooler now. Autumn had come like it always did, quietly at first, then all at once. The trees traded their greens for gold and rust. The wind turned sharper. The streets felt slower, like they knew the year was winding down. Darius Knox walked those streets again, not because he had to, because he chose to. Same Camry, same hoodie, different silence, not the silence of suspicion anymore, but the kind that comes after a lesson is learned, not by everyone, but by enough. He parked in front of the community center just before dusk. A few kids were still outside, tossing a football in uneven spirals. A man on a ladder was fixing the welcome sign. A woman swept fallen leaves into neat piles like she was tidying the season itself. No one looked up when Darius stepped out of the car, and that somehow was the most respectful gesture of all. He was no longer a spectacle, no longer a story in motion. He was just part of the place now. Inside, a small group had gathered. No cameras, no chairs in rows, just a circle on the floor. Some teachers, some students, a social worker, a police liaison who looked 25 and uncertain. Darius nodded at the host and sat near the edge. He didn't say much, just listened. Stories were shared, struggles, hopes. A teenage girl talked about her little brother getting stopped while biking home. A boy said he was tired of being told to speak differently when he's around important people. The officer shared that he sometimes feels like he's wearing two uniforms, his own and the one society puts on him because he's Latino. Nobody yelled, nobody cried, but the air was thick with truth. When it was his turn, Darius stood slowly. He pulled his hood up, not as a symbol, not to make a point, just because he was cold. But the room noticed, and he let them. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I just have one reminder." He paused, let the quiet fill the room like warm water. "Don't confuse silence with weakness." Another pause. "And don't confuse a hoodie with permission." He looked at the boy who mentioned being followed. "At some point, they're going to try to make you feel small, like you're a shadow, not a person." He glanced around the circle. "And when that happens, you don't have to fight to prove your light. Just stand still long enough, and the truth will reflect off of you." He sat down, and that was it. No applause, no "Thank you, Mr. Knox." Just the nods of people who understood. Later that night, walking back to his car, a young woman caught up to him. "Mr. Knox," she said, "sorry, do you mind if I ask something?" He stopped, smiled. "Not at all." She hesitated, then, "Why didn't you fight back when it happened?" "At the stop?" Darius nodded slowly, like he'd been asked this before. But this time, he answered differently. "Because some fights are traps." She furrowed her brow. He continued, "They want you loud, angry, reactive. That way they can point and say, 'See, that's the problem.'" He adjusted his hood. "So sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay still until they run out of bullets made of doubt." The girl stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thanks," she said. "That helps more than you think." On his drive home, the streets rolled by like familiar faces. Stores closing, lights flickering on in kitchens, a boy skateboarding with headphones, hoodie bouncing behind him like a cape. Darius smiled. It wasn't about the past anymore. It wasn't even about the fight. It was about the continuance. The quiet, stubborn insistence of people like him to keep existing with dignity. At home, Moses greeted him with two quick tail thumps and a yawn. They sat on the porch again, like they always did, mug in hand, hoodie up. And for the first time in months, Darius felt peace, not because justice had been served, but because he had stayed true. And sometimes that's the rarest kind of justice. In a drawer nearby sat the letter from Caleb, and next to it, the one-liner he wrote to himself weeks ago, "Be louder in the way only you can." He read it again, not because he forgot, but because reminders aren't just for those who follow. They're for those who lead. Weeks later, a school in another state adopted a program called the Hoodie Hour, a 45-minute weekly session where students could speak openly about race, identity, and bias. They named it after the movement his photo helped spark. Darius never went there, never asked for credit, but when they mailed him a thank you letter signed by 212 students, he smiled quietly and put it in the same drawer, next to Caleb's. By then, the city had moved on. Price was a footnote, the scandal a case study. But Darius, he had become something else entirely, a standard, not for perfection, but for how to stand still in the middle of a storm and not lose your name. A friend once asked him, "What made you different, D?" Darius shrugged. "Nothing." Then added, "Except I knew who I was before they told me who I couldn't be." And so the hoodie walked on, through grocery aisles, through courtrooms, through sidewalks lined with fear and misunderstanding. It walked into schools, into offices, into precincts. It walked past the looks, past the questions, past the systems that trembled not at its color, but at the calm it refused to surrender. Because behind that hoodie, there was never just a man. There was a story, a black story, that refused to whisper anymore. Sometimes the loudest stories aren't told with shouts. They're told in silence, in stillness, in presence. Like a black man in a hoodie, standing calmly while the system tries to look away. Darius Knox never raised his voice, but the system heard him. The world saw him. And the silence? It made noise. Anyway, because when you stand still, undeniable, unbothered, unafraid dash, they have to look. And that's why we tell these stories. Because behind every hoodie, there's a black story that matters, that deserves to be told, heard, and remembered. If this story reached you, if it made you pause, if it made you feel something, don't stop here. Subscribe to Silent Power Stories for more black stories behind the hoodie, the ones they don't show on TV, the ones that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Turn on the bell because the next story might be yours or someone you love, and share this video with someone who still believes silence means weakness. Help them learn that power doesn't always shout. And if you're wearing a hoodie today, if you've ever been judged or overlooked or made to feel like your story was too quiet to matter, know this: we see you, we hear you, we carry your story with us because we are still here and we're not done walking. This was a Silent Power story, and we're just getting started.